Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. If you have not had the opportunity of joining a donors forum in the last few years, you may not have met me. My name is Tom Karen. I'm the Vice President of Donor Services, and I have been classroom adjacent for the vast majority of my career. So I can't help but start by saying, good morning. There we go. Okay, so I want to make sure everyone is awake. This is an opportunity for us all to learn. And so I do think this classroom setting comes with a few other parameters that I want you to be aware of. One, this is intended to be engaging for you all, so there will be questions, there will be answers. We want you to be able to participate in a dialogue with us. So we won't necessarily call you out by name, but if I see a question forming in your mind, I will come up to you and I will bring the microphone. You can still pass, but again, we want this to be an engaging classroom. So again, thank you for coming this morning. This is the Donors Forum for Northeast Florida. This is the one opportunity for regional grant makers and philanthropists to come together to learn about area opportunities, to do co-investment, and also to learn about how philanthropy informs our identity as an individual, and as well as how it informs our family dynamics. So the latter part of this is why we're gathered here today. And I could not be more delighted than I am to have Coventry Edwards-Pitt join us today from Boston. When I joined the Community Foundation 2 years ago, Joanne, my predecessor, I was very eager. I'm a learner, again, classroom adjacent, was very excited. What should I read? What should I engage with? And she said, I have the first book I'm recommending you read is called Raised, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise. And it was such an insightful book on so many levels, both as a professional, but also as a parent raising 2 young daughters. And I'm delighted that you now have been able to get to know Covie over the last 2 years. And she's now come out with a third book. And the lessons that she has gathered from over 50 plus interviews is insightful not only to those who have inherited, but also to every family dynamic, I think, in this room and for myself. So I'm excited for you all to have the opportunity to engage with her. I'm going to do a 10-minute break so you can start enjoying your salads and making some conversation at your table. If you have not had the pleasure of meeting everyone yet, please do so. I did not come up with a warm-up question, but what is one thing that you're looking forward to for this summer? Everyone may have believe it or not, summer is around the corner. I feel like we just got past spring break, but now we're already trying to plan our summer vacation, and I have not gotten there. So if you don't have anything planned yet, this is an opportunity for inspiration from others at the table. So we'll do a 10-minute break, and then Coventry will come up to begin her presentation. Thank you all.
Tom encouraged me to get the festivities moving here so I can start to share with you some of what I've learned over the last 10 years of research in this field. So my name is Coventry, but I go by Covie, and I'm down here from Boston at the wonderful invitation of the Community Foundation. So pleased to be with you all, and I love Jacksonville, and it's just been really nice to be here. So thank you all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my books, and there are 3 books now, and we have about 25 minutes of me talking, so I won't get into extreme detail, but I do want to give you at least an overview of each of the books so that you have a sense of the topics that they cover, and then when we get into the Q&A, I do, as Tom said, I do encourage you to ask questions because I love questions, and I have all these stories from the interviews that I've done over these 10 years in my head, and usually I can find some story that might be useful to answer a question. So I really encourage you to be taking some note of questions you might want to ask when we get to that. So, all right, so I am the chief creative officer of a firm that's a wealth advisory firm based in the Boston area and also a Palm Beach office. And people sometimes think, why is someone who does that writing these books? But I do feel very lucky to be at my firm. Our name's Ballentine Partners because our founder actually came from a family business setting himself. And I think because that was his living experience growing up, I think he just fundamentally knew that this is about a lot more than money. It's about family relationships and what gives life meaning. And so when I was interested to start to interview our clients and others, the firm was really supportive of really trying to get to the bottom of some of these most intractable issues. People tend to come to advisors like us with very nuts and bolts questions, investments or estate planning or whatever. But what I learned doing this for over 20 years now is that you can solve those problems. As I was once hearing that a therapist said there's a difference between a problem and a dilemma, and a problem has a solution. And a dilemma just needs to really be thought about. And what we're going to talk about today are really dilemmas. And what I have learned from interviews with people who've lived through all this and done it well, the best ways to approach these dilemmas so that people end up feeling that their heart and the relationships and the things that matter to them most in life are reconciled with their financial resources. So my first book that Tom said very nice things about was called Raised Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise. And it came out in 2014, almost 10 years ago now. And it was aimed at parents trying to do a good job raising their children amid abundance. And it's actually incredibly universal. You don't need a ton of money to spoil a child. You actually don't even need money at all to spoil a child. You can spoil a child with too much time, too much help, too much doing for them what they could do themselves. So that book was based on interviews I conducted with kids who had been raised amid affluence, and sadly, statistics bear out that sometimes it is a grew up to be motivated, content, grounded, engaged in life. And I just asked them, how did this happen for you? What messages did you hear from your parents? And then that book summarizes those messages. And I was curious to hear too, because I'm a parent myself. My daughter is now 13. And I was saying to Tom last night that it is hard to be a parent because even though I should know this stuff by now, right? I mean, I've done these interviews for years. I wrote this book. Even having these things living in my mind, I see myself as a parent day to day. The right answer is never usually the one that first comes to you, because what usually comes to you is, how do I please my child, or how do I make this problem go away? And often that is saying yes to what the child is wanting, when really the right approach is basically in many ways to say no, but to do it with compassion and with an explanation that helps them understand why it is you're saying no. It's not because you're being mean, it's actually because you love them and you want them to develop the skills to do these things on their own. But even knowing that, I can just share, it takes creativity and intentionality on a daily basis to remind yourself of that. I was sharing the story of how my daughter and I were sharing an iPad several years ago, and at some point it became clear that it would be easier if we had two iPads. But I had to just stop myself from just going and buying this device for her and solving the problem, because I found myself sort of knocking my head and saying, okay, remember the book. I actually have to try to invent a way for my then, 9-year-old to feel like she can do something to help her earn this device herself. And it took me about 3 days of racking my brain to come up with a way that my 9-year-old could earn the kind of money that might feel to her to be a meaningful contribution. And what I finally came up with, it was these photo books, the albums that we do in our family through Shutterfly or whatever, that my poor husband devotes probably 3 weekends to doing. And we were 3 years behind. And I encouraged her to do these. And I said, if you do them, I will pay you per book. And she did them. And she had such pride in having done something herself to contribute to this iPad. And I got the added benefit of seeing what our year looks like from the perspective of my 9-year-old. So all to say, that's what that book is about. And I say that you could sort of summarize. I do encourage you to read the full book because the stories are everything and you hear from people verbatim. But if you could summarize that book in really one line, it's all of people who might inherit some money or even get some financial help from parents. They need to go through a phase in their life where they prove to themselves that they don't need this money to feel like a capable person. They have to go out and go through that identity maturation journey, and it's only once they have gotten there that they can then come back to whatever inheritance they might end up receiving, any financial gifts, and engage with that from a sense of agency and from authority. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because Wealth generators, they can say to themselves, well, look, it's great I've made this money, but if this money disappeared tomorrow, I'd be okay because I went out and made this and I could do it again. Inheritors actually have to get to that same headspace. They have to feel like I would be okay if this money went away tomorrow. And if you think about it, that can be very challenging if you are a kid who's grown up in an environment where everything has always been pretty much defined around all of these nice things you have. So enough on that book. The second book is what people appreciated the most, I think about that, my first book, was this positive formula. It was talking about what can go right and how to have it go right. And people like that because there's a lot of the opposite out there. So then I thought, it'd be really interesting to apply this positive formula to another big sort of dilemma area I see in my work all the time, which is the whole topic of aging. Not only how do each of us as people here in the world age vibrantly ourselves. That's the first half of the book. I talk to awesome later life people, I call them, and who are just having a really good time. And the things that enable them to do that, which is basically, the acronym is AGED, and I can just summarize it for you. The first one is agency, feeling like I'm the author of my own life. I'm not waiting on someone else to come make this work for me. Every day I get up, and one woman said to me, every day I get up and my number one job is to make lemonade out of lemons. And that, I thought that was a great way to go about things. The G stands for growth, which, hey, you're all here learning, wonderful. It's basically challenging yourself to continue to learn. That whole, old dog can't learn new tricks, that is actually not, I don't know if it's right for dogs. I haven't tried on mine, but it's not right for people because, our neurons actually continue to develop. And so, but what I talk about in that book is what's hard about learning new things is you actually have to go through some meaningful time where you're bad at something. And that is hard. It's hard when you have other things that you're really good at. It feels safer to stay in the things you're good at. And there's a great story in that book of a guy who tried yoga for the first time at age 60 and had to crawl out of the room on his hands and knees, but past all of the really fit 25-year-olds. And he said it was just so, forget how physically torturous it was just so embarrassing. It was really just embarrassing, and sort of pushing through that embarrassment to continue to expose yourself to challenge and new things. And the E in the book is engaged, so being among people, forming new relationships, forming relationships with people who are different from you, because that's actually really good for the brain. And the last one is drive, which is all about how do we recreate that sense of purpose. There are phases in life when purpose is sort of served up to all of us on a silver platter. Either you have work that needs you, or you have a child who needs you, or there's always something that must be done. And then you get to a phase when some of that busyness and purpose sort of flits away. And my book talks about how people then found that new thing and the creative ways in which they did that. And that turns out to be really important because I even end up talking about dementia and how there's these crazy studies that showed people who after they passed, upon autopsy, had all of the physical signs of dementia, but didn't actually present that way in life. And they think one of the reasons that is because they had very high purpose scores when they were studied. So I encourage you all this is good for any multitaskers who have a long list of things they still want to get done in their life, because I think that's good. I often, when I'm trying to help people elicit what that purpose could be, I ask a question that I share in the book, which is, if this were your last day on earth, what would you regret not having had a chance to do? Who would you regret not having had a chance to be? And I even actually changed my own life as a result of writing that book. That book came out in 2017, and when I puzzled over that question, I thought, I know what that is. I have a whole side art life, and I started to feel a real sense of urgency that I wasn't devoting time to that. So now my work schedule is I work 3 days a week, and I spend the rest of it doing my art, which I don't know if anyone else cares about, but it makes me happy. So that's good. And I don't feel like I'm leaving something on the table anymore that would be important to me. So, okay, but let's transition now to the third book. So this third book is called Engaged, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise. I'm going to go here. Yay, it didn't die. Yay, it's here. Okay, so now I took this success story format and I applied it to an incredibly little studied area in my field, in the wealth advising field, which is the whole topic of what happens when someone, a young person who's going to inherit wealth, and I should just say, what I meant by inheritor was they have inherited, they may one day inherit, or even if they don't inherit, their whole sense of identity is so shaped by the fact that their parents had excess means, essentially, that it feels in some way that they have inherited that identity of affluence. So when that person goes and meets their significant other, so the whole story of what it's like to be that young couple and all the ways in which wealth and family affluence swirls around that, the sort of forming of that relationship, it getting off the ground as they start to deepen the relationship, get married, and start to have their own family. So how I got into this was, as Tom said, I interviewed 50 people. It was including 22 couples, ranging in age from their 30s to their 70s, and all still in their first marriages. And interestingly too, about 80% of them are couples who would view themselves as someone who inherited money, married to someone who didn't. So I asked them all these very open-ended questions, just share with me the story of you guys. How did you meet? How did it go for you? Tell me how wealth first came up for you when you first met. How did wealth come up when you were starting to talk about getting married? How about when you were starting to build your own family? And then I just listened to people's stories. And I am out here talking about this book for a couple of reasons. One is, I first of all heard from almost everybody I interviewed, I wish this book had existed for me when I was going through this. They said, nothing is out there. I wish I'd had this earlier in my life. The other thing is that they started to really share, and you'll hear very candidly with me, and I heard things I have never heard before, even though I work with my inheriting generation clients all the time. I think I have a good relationship with them. But I realized this was different because often, first of all, I had the couple on together. So it wasn't just the child of the affluent parent. It was the couple together, and the lens was squarely on their experience. And I had guaranteed them anonymity. So they knew that what they shared would not get back to their parents, would not get back to their even advisory team. And so it was quite eye-opening and humbling. I gave another talk, and I give another talk to the advisor community because there's like 5 things, significant things that I will never do the same again as an advisor as a result of these interviews. But the other talk I talk about is this generation's parents, and that's what I'm going to share today, about things I would encourage parents to think about a bit differently based on what I heard. So I'm going to get into the lessons. But I'm eager to hear your questions. So just want to briefly describe the arc of the book. So the book had 3 sections. And I started out to sort of talk about love and marriage. And what I learned pretty quickly in these interviews is the story doesn't really begin there. What actually happens is, particularly from the perspective of someone who is an inheritor themselves, in order to get to a place in their own mind and heart where they're ready for a relationship, their significant relationship in life, they have to go through this individuation process and maturation process. And they have to figure out who they are outside of and beyond their family's wealth. They kind of have to, as I was saying before, prove to themselves they don't need this money and come back and engage with it. So that's what the first section is about, on your own. The second section is about just the 2 of us. It's about the couple's experience of meeting, how they built trust with each other. I get into 2 chapters on prenups. I'll summarize those quickly, but that is really worth reading. That was one of the most eye-opening parts. And then finally, there's a chapter devoted to the conversations that I heard from these people that were important for the 2 of them to have together, to get on the same page about how they're going to view money. So as I mentioned, a lot of them came from different economic backgrounds. And so things like, how should we think about any money that we inherit? Should we use it? Should we not use it? What types of uses are actually going to be relationship affirming for us versus those that won't? How do we reconcile spending philosophies that might be different? And then the final section is beyond us. So this now talks about the ecosystem that surrounds any young couple, their families. There's a chapter on the families and how to actually make someone who is marrying into family that might have more resources feel truly included, and the difference between inclusion that feels like inclusion to that marrying in person and inclusion that feels less than that, feels to the parents and the family perhaps like inclusion, but feels to the recipient as tolerance, but not fully inclusion. The next chapter is all on parenting, when these people now start to parent themselves and all the conversations that are important to have around that. So as I mentioned, my first book is aimed at parents. So when I sat down to write this chapter, I thought, now, what am I going to do I don't want to recreate that book, obviously. That already exists. But what I really started to realize thinking about that was my first book is, I think, very useful for parents. In order to actually effectively implement those lessons, though, you need two prerequisites. One is you need to make a decision as parents that you're going to be intentional about how you parent. A lot of parenting is a little bit on the fly, and you need to kind of make an intentional decision and then do a lot of thinking about what that's going to mean, about the values you're going to actually hope to inculcate in your children when they're young, and reinforce when they're older, by the way, because a lot of these issues start to really come up when kids are in their 20s, and money starts to actually flow to them through gifts or otherwise. But the second prerequisite is couples have to be on the same page with one another. Not always the case. So that chapter really gets into the types of discussions that parents need to have with each other. Things like, even where should we live? Where we live broadcasts something about our values. Let's make sure that that decision is intentional. Or what might we choose to sacrifice in our own life so that our child has a broader concept of what is normal? What is normal airfare? What is a normal vacation? Would they be able to answer that question if someone gave them a pop quiz, because perhaps they haven't really experienced a wide array of experiences. And then the final chapter is what was fascinating to me. I actually had to add it when I was writing because it wasn't in my initial outline, but it came out loud and clear in the interviews. I called it Breaking Free, which is a little bit controversial in our industry, but basically I heard from all these people that at some point they needed to reorient the advisors in their life, their wealth advisor, their trustee, perhaps their family office if they had one, so that they felt that those people stood for them and not just their parents. And there was a critical shift that happened around that. And so we'll get more into that. But let's just go into some of the lessons for parents. So, okay, as I mentioned, the first section is all about how do I, as a young person, individuate amid this wealth? And what I summarize real quick are the challenges. There's three major challenges that I think young people trying to individuate amid wealth feel. One is a real sense of shame. Not everyone feels shame, but those who do really feel it. It's a sense of shame about an unearned advantage. How did I just wake up on this side of the fence with all these resources when there are so many people in the world who don't have this? And that has become even more, that was true about 40 years ago. There was maybe some shame among inheritors. That has, I think, burgeoned into a societal anthem, a generational anthem that sometimes you might see anti-capitalism, stuff like that. It's all sort of like, how do I reconcile the good person I feel I am in my heart with all this inequality that I perceive to be out there and all the problems that I perceive in the world? And that's really hard for some young people, particularly when they feel that all this largesse that they get to enjoy was due to no effort on their own. Okay, the second thing is the looming shadows of their very successful parents that they really struggle with knowing if they'll ever be able to surpass in their heart. That's very hard for young people to deal with when they're coming from that situation. And the third one is support, either financial support or just well-meaning people doing things for them. That means kids don't have to do things for themselves and really undermines their sense of capacity in their own capabilities. So with these challenges being out there, I mentioned the sort of antidote is kids have to build the sense of self-efficacy brick by brick, and there's no shortcut to doing that. They just got to get out and work and do it and support themselves and get through problems on their own. But there are things we can do to help, both as advisors and parents. And so the things I recommend, understand these challenges. I sometimes have conversations with parents where they're like, I don't understand why my kid isn't interested in learning about this stuff. I don't understand why they don't want to. When I start to explain these things about shame and looming success of the parents and the support, like a light bulb goes off and parents think, this is exactly what I'm hearing from my kid, that this is sort of some of the thoughts swirling in their mind. So understand this is happening. Allow space. I actually think parents should just let kids in their 20s go off and become the people they're meant to be in life. There's something funny. How many of us have noticed how many Disney movies kill the parents off in the first 5 minutes? I think there's a reason for this, which is that what they're trying to do is create a narrative environment for the hero at the center of that story to have a hero's myth sort of arc with all of its trials and tribulations and ups and downs. Like Frozen would have been a lot different if Elsa and Anna's parents were around to be like, honey, make sure you bring your coat to the ice palace, and no, don't even, we're going to send out the search party. Different story. So think of that when you're thinking of intervening or helping your 20-something child, because you kind of have to exit stage right, hopefully not really the way Disney does it, but just at least in concept, so the kid will have the motivation to do this for themselves. And by the way, they're going to complain about it all the time. I mean, kids don't recognize this until about 15 years later. When I did the interviews for the first book, I got a lot of like, oh my gosh, I hated that my parents didn't help me with this or whatever. But now I realized that what they were doing was showing me I could do it myself. And they actually were also showing me they were confident that I could do it myself. So that's the other thing about broadcasting confidence. So what you have to do with this as a parent is to not overhelp. I share a story from my first book about, a daughter who told me how proud she was she got a job on her own. And then I talked to the dad, and he's like, yes, but first she came to me and asked me to help her get that job, and I actually didn't know anyone, so I couldn't. And what's amazing is she tells me this story 2 years on, and she's just glowing with pride about how she did this herself. And she doesn't mention the whole thing about asking Dad. And I don't think it's because she didn't want me to know about that. I think it's because all she remembers about this 2 years on was, I did it. I did it myself. All Dad remembers 2 years, 5 years, 10 years on was how horrible the experience was of watching his daughter for 6 months not get a job and keep being told no or whatever. And so I encourage people to realize that the parent's experience of a child's struggle and the child's experience of their struggle are different. And when parents assume that this child will never be able to deal with the struggle and intervene, they sort of strip the child from eventually having to being able to convert that struggle into the pride that I heard in that daughter's voice. So the other thing I'd say is, so first, don't overhelp, and the lesson to the advisors, and if you have advisors you're working with, a lot of us in our field and a lot of wealth-generating parent clients are seeking advisors who provide multi-generational services, which tends to mean things that help the child, help that young adult child, help them figure out how to rent that apartment, remind them that they have to send their tax forms in, do all these things, basically hand-holding for kids. And that hand-holding is valuable to the parent because it does enable the parent to not have to play that role. But I will say, what I learned from these interviews is that hand-holding is actually not valuable for these kids. There's a story, I don't have time to get into today, but a woman who now is in her 50s and says that when she was in her 20s, she kind of like gave up doing all those adulting things that, paying her bills, figuring out how to get insurance, because the family office stepped in and did those things. And the message was sort of like, that's what you pay for, so we should have them do that. And now she's 30 years later, and she's like, that was so infantilizing. I ended up feeling by the time I was 30, I had no idea how to do any of these things that my friends knew how to do. And she's entirely changing the plan for her own children. And she's basically really reducing the services that the people around them will provide so that they can learn how to do these things themselves. And sometimes parents struggle with, well, isn't that punitive? Like my kids know I can help them. So if I'm not helping, aren't I being punitive? Or they know the advisor could help. And I just help parents by saying, just be transparent about it. Of course I could buy this for you. Of course I could help you do this. But I'm not, because I want you to do these things for yourself, and I love you, and I want you to build that skill. And I want you to have that sense of joy that you will get from doing that, and just explain it. So, and the last thing on this page is I'll say, oh, yeah, thank you. Tom's telling me, running out. I'm going to wrap this up so we have time for questions. But the last thing on this page is sometimes information, when kids are in this really important maturation phase, can be not helpful. When kids are still experiencing shame and haven't yet formed that sense of self, being reminded about wealth that the family might have is distancing to them. So I encourage all of us to help kids with education that's useful for them, which basically turns out to be about money that they feel is their own. Like, I just got a first job, and I don't understand what this paycheck means. So let's help them understand that. Let's talk about that versus like, how do you select money managers? Like, they don't care about that because it's not relevant to their life. This one is an important one, which is about when kids go and become that adult self that they're on their way to being. Often when they meet their partner, that partner is the first person who sees them as that adult they want to be. If you think back to any of you who are in a marriage that you're happy in, and you think back to how your spouse saw you and how that felt to you. And often I heard from both partners that each partner sort of acted as a mirror for the other of the self they want to be, that person who sort of keeps you your best self. What's interesting is often that involves the person who's the inheritor changing. They're changing to become their adult self, which sometimes looks different than the teenager they were when they were in their parents' house. And what happens sometimes is that parents see their kid changing, and they think the partner is to blame. They think the partner is the person who's changing the child, when sometimes I see it's just that the partner's allowing the kid to become who they want to be. And there's a wonderful story in here about a guy who said just that, which is that I finally, when I met my spouse-to-be, I could finally be my true self. And she allowed me to be that true self. So I encourage parents to see their child's partner as the gift that the child might see them to be. And by the way, I should just say, we all know relationships that probably should not have worked out from the get-go. This book is about the good relationships, of which I've been blessed in my career to see mostly that. And what I see happening is these are relationships that should work if only wealth didn't kind of make things so complicated that people don't know how to work through these issues. So, okay. And then there's 2 chapters on prenups. I would just say, please read the book and read those chapters before recommending your child have a prenup. Our entire firm has changed our entire way of practice based on these interviews. I'm not talking about all prenups. I'm not talking about later life prenups or blended marriage prenups. I'm talking really about first marriages with a young couple where one of the children will inherit wealth and may have already inherited some wealth, which is most likely in some sort of a trust. That's a very common fact pattern I see. And generally speaking, to short circuit that whole thing, I think it's rarely necessary. But if it is really necessary in a situation you're aware of, I'd say read this and go through a mediated prenup process rather than the typical one. And what I heard from these couples, as I said, I interviewed them and I just asked this open-ended question. When I asked the question, tell me how wealth came up when you were first talking about marriage, often I would hear maybe a third of our conversation became about how that prenup thing went for them, even if it was 35 years ago. And there were still tears, and there were still, absolute recalled memories, lived memories, and bodily held emotions about that. And so I just thought, I never will view this as it tends to be discussed in our industry as a pro forma, check the box item, standard risk management best practice. Now I'm encouraging us all as a community to understand that we need to broaden the definition of risk. It's not just financial risk. There's also human risks that can be introduced by putting a prenup on the table. And so understanding that. So I'll encourage you to read that because I can't do justice to the stories that I heard. I wish I could have. I think I had about 400 pages of transcripts just on the prenup. So the book summarizes that. And the last thing I will say is I was mentioning about how there's this chapter on breaking free. So what I thought was interesting is I wrote about inheritors and their partners becoming parents. And one of the questions that I encourage people to think about when they're planning their own intentional parenting is, am I the grown-up myself that I hope my children will be? And that's a very interesting question for self-reflection. And often the answer is not 100%. But what I heard in these interviews was it was often if people ask themselves that question, often the one area remaining in their life where they couldn't say, yeah, I think I am an adult and a grown-up, that one remaining area was their wealth management ecosystem. Either their advisor was still, because it had been the same advisor as their parents had used, sort of viewing them as maybe the subordinate in the relationship, or there was a trustee that they were still working with even though they were 50 years old. Things like this. And what I found is that parenting is a very powerful catalyst. When people become parents, they start to think about, as we all know who are parents, the whole world shifts. And all of a sudden, things that people were okay living with for themselves, or even for themselves and their partners, when they started to think about, am I okay with my child living with this? A lot of them said, no way. And so what they do is start to come back to the wealth advisor or the family office or the trustee and say, we would like to make some changes. And either those systems adapted and were able to be more flexible to help those young people parent in the way they chose. So like a good example is a family office that has a standard rule to make mandatory distributions to children after a certain age. These parents who were inheritors themselves and lived through that when they were coming up and felt like it wasn't great for them, they now want to change the system so that's not going to happen. And what I saw was either the family office says, okay, we hear you. We can try to do things a little differently. And rather than having the family move in lockstep where every sibling group does it exactly the same, people can do things around their own nuclear families. Or the family office or the advisor doesn't change, in which case I heard a lot about people replacing those systems, getting rid of them, and creating something new. And what they said often was that was the hardest thing I did because, my family was mad at me. All these horrible things happened, but I'm so glad I did it. That ever since, I've been able to feel like the advisors in my life really stand for me. I feel liberated. They use words like liberated and free, and I feel joy because I finally I was saying to Tom, often this related to philanthropy, because they felt free to finally have their sense of true self be integrated with this whole wealth world, and when those two things came together, they finally felt free to use that money to do the things with it that they thought were meaningful. So often unleashed a lot of philanthropy and interest in impact investing. So, all right. So that's kind of the very quick summary of that book, but I do encourage you to read it, and I hope that people will ask questions, and I can get into more detail around that. So thank you. Tom's coming around with the mic.
As you know, we're in the digital age.
Yes.
And I happen to have only one grandson that's going on 13 to 23 right now. He sees everything on YouTube, etc. If he has a question, he comes to me, or comes like my hope nobody takes this offensive. Grandma, how were you born? How did you get conceived? Well, that's something you ought to talk to your dad about. No. But long story short, they look it up online.
Oh, sure. Yes, you're saying they look up, they understand how much money the family has because they look it up, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you. And my daughter is also 13 going on 23. But anyway, this is so true. And this is why, so in my first book and in this book, I get into this whole issue of how to communicate about the wealth to kids. And you're right that, first of all, kids are savvy. You can use Zillow and figure out how much the house is worth. If anyone's at some public company, they can get that figured out immediately. So I encourage, what I saw from the interviews in my first book, when I asked this question, how did this go for you? How did your parents talk about the money? A couple things were true. One is the parents never lied. It was, oh, no, we have the same amount of money as other people. It was, yes, there's actually the phrase someone used, which I thought was brilliant, was, there's money here, we hope you never need it. Which I think the point being, and what I heard from that book too, is that the kids knew there was money. They also were told very transparently, yes, you may or may not inherit some wealth someday, but whether or not you get wealth, what's important is that you spend these critical years of your life figuring out how to be a competent and effective person, whether or not you inherit money, because your doing that will help you feel like a happier person. it will help you be prepared the day that you ever do inherit this money. And so just being transparent about, I sometimes hear people say, will they work if they know there's money? And I think the way you get around that as a parent is you say, there might be money for you, but that has nothing to do with whether you're going to work, because you should work for you, not for the money. You should work because it will give you joy and meaning and a sense of contribution, and we want those things for you as your parents. So it should never be if there's, now perhaps the money might make it possible that the work they do could create less income for them, but it's not like, should I work or should I lie on the couch because of the money? And there's a lot more in the books about how to do that well. And I just think being transparent with kids, and also remember using this 20s not to, our industry talks a lot about, great, like get the kids involved, involve them in, the philanthropy, involve them at the family meetings. I really think that's appropriate, but after kids have developed a sense of self and maturation. So I'd say let them go and do their own thing in the 20s and say, yeah, sure, we could invite you, but we want you to be able to focus on your own life right now. And then often what happens is the kids come back of their own volition, say in their 30s, and start to say, yeah, I don't really know what all these trusts are, and I want to better understand. I want to understand how this stuff works, and I want to be helpful. And so the kids start asking these questions, and that's a great time to start to share because they're receptive. So thank you for that question. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you for writing these books. It's extremely valuable.
Thank you.
Oftentimes when you have a family where a generation are the wealth creators and they have a philosophy that they want to provide a life for their children that is beyond what was provided for them when they were growing up. And that can create a situation where children are enabled in all the different ways that you described. And you've spoken a lot about children going off to establish themselves and then coming back more prepared to inherit this wealth potentially. But do you have any advice for a situation where those children may not be as prepared because they've sort of leaned into this enabled lifestyle, and now parents are realizing there's a dilemma and they need to try and play catch up with some life skills that they may not have formed on their own? I mean, I know you're not a parenting counselor,
no,
but
I kind of am actually. I mean, I thank you for that question, and I mean that is the rub of this work. That is, it always comes down to that. Basically, parents realize too late that the kid has not mastered those adulting skills, and often where I see that, and probably anyone else who does this work, the parents say, can you help my kid learn how to budget? Can you help them learn about investing? But really what that is code for is, can you teach them to be a capable person in their life who feels confident in their own abilities and is not dependent upon this wealth I'm giving them? So all to say, it's a very common problem. I wrote my first book aimed at parents because I'm very familiar with those very kids myself through all of my work. I wrote this book for them. For them to say, look, we all can blame our parents for different things in life, but at some point you have to just sit there and think, this is my one and only life. And the first section of this book is written squarely for them to say, how do you get yourself to the point where you don't have to have that sense in your heart that everything around you is there only because mom and dad or the trustee is providing it. I actually have two things I want to share that I think are pretty important and that I put into this book. One is, I think, if you've all heard of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, okay, so it starts with the basic needs, security, goes up to financial, and then gets eventually to love and belonging, and finally self-actualization. What's interesting is that bottom rung of basic needs have a lot to do with things that you provide yourself when you support yourself. Your house, your food, your sort of basic comfort. And the way Maslow talks about it is you sort of have to provide these needs on the bottom before you can move up. And I had an insight that I think it may be for a lot of these kids who are struggling and are enabled, part of, I think, the self-esteem issues that happen there is because they know in their heart of hearts that they are not providing for their basic needs. My question sort of is like, what if you had to earn those levels yourself? What if a little voice in your head says, I only have this house over my head or the food that I'm enjoying because someone who I really have no control over is making it happen for me, and they could change their mind tomorrow. The trust could stop making distributions. Mom and dad would maybe not give the annual exclusion gift. They haven't really proved to themselves that they can take care of these needs for themselves, and therefore they can't really move up the ladder. And I think sometimes we get it backwards and say, you kid, focus on what you're passionate about. We'll take care of everything else. And I think it's actually just the opposite. Kids have to work their way up the ladder, and once they have those needs provided on their own, there's also an equation in there, because sometimes kids are, for good reasons, living off to some degree, some sort of help. You know, they're either in an artistic career or something. They're out there, they're trying to work, but they're making very little money. And so I put an equation in there for kids to help them think about, how comfortable am I using family resources to support my lifestyle? And so it's a very simple equation. It has only two terms. And the first one is my sense of self, as defined as from 0 to 1, like a percentage, 0 to 100%. And obviously this is subjective, but it's like my sense of self, meaning, do I feel capable of being an adult in the world without all of this stuff? And it's that minus the percentage of my lifestyle that is covered by someone other than me. Has to be greater than or equal to 0. So basically, if you're a fledgling 23-year-old, haven't worked at all, you know, that sense of self might be 10, you know, it's not 80 or 90. So I would suggest not providing more than 10% of your lifestyle from excess money other than what you can do for yourself. If, on the other hand, you're a pretty mature 32-year-old, you've already proved to yourself you're capable, you know who you'd be with or without this money, I think you could actually live entirely off of your trust and you'd be fine. You'd still be at 0, at least. You wouldn't be below 0, which is where you don't want to be. So I think it provides sort of just a framework for kids to try to think about this trade-off themselves. There's also a really good letter in here that I encourage you to read. It's in chapter 1. This woman wrote into this advice columnist, Ask Polly, and it sounded like so many of the kids I know who struggle with this. She was basically like, I'm 26 years old. I am incapable of doing anything because everything's always been provided for me. I work for my dad. And she said, I have been given every advantage in the world, and I still can't make it work. And that's, I think, how a lot of these kids feel. And then the answer that the advice columnist gave was awesome. And so I encourage you to read that. But it was basically like, yeah, you need to get out from under. She says, you're living a velveteen rabbit life. You have to go be real, you know? So, and more details. Okay, other questions?
I know it's a bigger room, but we do want to make this as conversational for you all. So, Covie, one of the questions we talked about last night was the role that philanthropy can play in the individuation process. So could you speak a little bit about best practices that you've seen families navigate?
Yes, and this question comes up a lot too. So what I'd say is, first of all, I think kids feel the most, kind of in keeping with all these other themes, kids feel the most invested in giving away money that they feel is their own money versus money that they've been given to give away. And an extension of this, I was once talking to a woman who was the executive director of a 7th generation family foundation. And they had been embarking on this process of trying to get the youngest generation involved. And she was sharing with me that first they tried a top-down approach and said, we'd like to have you all join the board and all this stuff. And they got 0 interest. And then they tried a different approach, which is they said to the teenagers, you guys all go out and find an organization you feel you care about enough to volunteer meaningful hours there. And we will then match the hours you put in with dollars from the family foundation. 100% uptake. And I thought this was such a brilliant suggestion because what they really did there was they allowed the kids to turn money that they perceived as not their own into money they perceived as their own through their own sweat equity of having put in the effort. It comes down to kids being able to feel that they're making a contribution that matters. And so if they could give that gift, whether or not they do anything, it doesn't feel like it matters. If they can give the gift only because they put some contribution in that is meaningful to them, that makes them feel like it's important. So, and then back to the space issue, I hear parents often lamenting, my kids are 24 and 25, we've given them money to give away, they're not even touching it, we've invited them to join the family foundation, they're not interested. Are they horrible, not generous people, basically. What have I done? Have I raised my kids so that they're not philanthropically minded? And I say, not at all, no fear. Basically, what this is that kids are doing exactly what they should be doing in their 20s. They're focused on their own life. They're focused on building their own capital. I was saying last night, I read a quote from a rabbi who talked about life as sort of like the journey that water takes when it rushes down from a mountain till finally when it reaches the sea. And he was saying, the early years of life, you are that gushing geyser that is coming out of that mountain so strong that it's strong enough to cut through the rock. That is sort of your sense of individualism. By the time you're in your later life, you have sort of blended with the ocean. That's sort of like the last stage of life. There is nothing of you that is self anymore. It's all others. And so parents and kids are at different stages on that water geyser. Kids are still cutting through the rock, being themselves, and that's exactly what they should be doing. Whereas parents are more closer to the ocean, and so I encourage parents not to give up hope. What I see, and there's a guy in our field, his name is Jamie Forbes of the Forbes family, and he talks about how when he was in his 20s, obviously his family had, named many buildings. There was an active family foundation. He had zero interest in being part of that. He talks about how philanthropy ignited for him not until he was in his 30s. He had his own young kids. He was on a family vacation. His kids were playing on the beach, and a little girl came up and pointed at the book that his daughter was reading and said, "What is that?" And they realized that this little child had never seen a book. And his kids were like, "What? They never seen a book?" And basically over 5-10 years, that family built a whole library in this town. But he said, that's when the spark of generosity was awakened for me. It was around his own nuclear family. So I just share that story because I think that is a very common evolution. And I think that parents should just understand that that's common and think it's okay if kids don't really want to be involved when they're in that critical maturation phase. So, yes, question.
I appreciate what you said about the sweat equity.
Yeah.
And I think that having a child with either intellectual, mental health, or physical disability, what we learned was we had to throw the rule book out, but not throw what we needed to do, was just how to do that with an adult child that actually you will be needing to provide for after you're gone. So that was in working with our financial advisor on that, because the balance of how to do that. So the sweat equity, the volunteer work, what you can do. And maybe you had some other examples in your books on that, but just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, so it sounds like you basically found a way to provide the support to be there that will be needed, but also to create opportunities for your child to feel like they had a sense of contribution that mattered. Am I hearing you right? Yeah, I think thank you for sharing that, because I think that is really what it's about. And I think sometimes what I see happening and where things can start to get problematic is parents do, I think, sometimes fundamentally wonder if their child is capable of doing things, whether or not they have documented learning challenges. You have highly successful parents who look at their kid and think, is this kid capable of doing these things? And kids, it's like, they say dogs sense fear. Kids sense fear too. I think that they pick up on that. And what they internalize then is, maybe I'm not capable of this. So I actually think it's far better to just fake it till you make it as a parent and think, you're going to do it. I'm confident in you. I think you can do it. And of course, you're there to support them. What the kids I interviewed for the first book said was, I know my parents would help me if I ever got into trouble. But it's important to me to feel like I'm not asking for that help if I don't really need it. And so it was a really nice blend of being perceived as that these parents, the people I interviewed for the first book view their parents as very generous people and supportive people, even though in actuality the parents weren't giving that much money. They were there to say, we believe in you. We think you can do this. So I do encourage parents to try to imagine their child being capable of these things and see what happens. Often the kids live up to the expectation and to the promise that the parent broadcasts in thinking the kid is capable. So there was a conversation last night about the challenge is when the kid does the thing, but not on the timetable that the parent wants them to do the thing. And it was a great conversation because one woman was saying her son's like that, and then another guy at the table said, I was that little boy. I basically was that, and I sort of drove my mom crazy because I never did things on the timetable, but I did them. Like I made it, and it made it work for me, and that's sort of who I am. So I think part of this is wrestling with your discomfort too as a parent, that it may not happen in the way you're hoping. I think that's a struggle for all of us as parents, me for sure. So thank you for that question. Yes?
I'm not sure how to ask this question, but I noticed as a father of teenagers, there's a lot of expectation that there's going to be community service hours from the school for graduation.
Yes.
If you want to enhance your resume to get into college, go start a club, clean up an abandoned, cemetery, or drill a well in Africa. What about just getting a job? And the notion that, that's probably going to be as meaningful of an experience. Just by the mere suggestion that you're going to do these things is an indication of privilege, because a lot of kids cannot afford the time or have the transportation or the ability to do these great deeds. It seems like the job, to me, is a more practical solution and can build more self-esteem.
I absolutely 100% agree with you. I think, first of all, I think colleges are onto this. I mean, some articles are talking now about how, just the volunteer experience does look like the kid, had the means to do that. I also wrote quite a bit in my first book about how meaningful a summer job is, how kids learned some fundamental skills in that experience that they didn't learn elsewhere. So first of all, that first paycheck, for kids who grew up amid wealthy parents, that's the first time they feel like, hey, maybe this domain of wealth is not just mom and dad. Maybe I can do something where I make money. It's a very powerful feeling. And then the corollary where they then spend that money on something, the first thing they buy themselves, and how meaningful that thing is to them. And it can be the rinky-dinkiest thing, but it means more than the most expensive gift they were given. And then there's also the how do you oppress an authority figure other than your parent or a teacher who, has to deal with you. And that all the life skills, there was a guy I interviewed who worked in a ski shop as a 15 or 16-year-old, and he said, I realized in the first week that the manager was incompetent. This 50-year-old guy was like not doing a good job. And I said, well, how'd that work out? He said, 2.5 weeks in, he put me in charge. And you think, look at what this young man figured out how to, do, sort of navigating all that. And the third thing is, especially on this privilege point, I heard from so many kids I interviewed about it was not until they had a summer job where they were working shoulder to shoulder next to someone who might actually be living off of this minimum wage that they finally had a real recognition of different paths in life, of the advantages to which they had been born, in a way that actually was meaningful for them and that they were on par. It was different than philanthropy, although that can be very helpful too, but where there's I have, you have less. It was we're in this together. We just happen to come from different backgrounds. Like the guy I interviewed said, look, when you turn 16, in my family, you got a job in the summer. He got a job as a dishwasher at this dockside grill. And he said half of the other guys on the line were like on DUI from prison and stuff. He said, look, I learned I don't have to be necessarily best friends with everyone, but I can learn from people. We actually had a lot of fun together. It was a way, I also talk a lot about teaching your kids socioeconomic fluency, like how do I relate to people effectively and meaningfully who don't necessarily come from what I come from? And it's in jobs like that you build that skill. So yes, my daughter's 13. I'm already looking up like how young can you be, right? Turns out there's a lot of jobs you can't do at 13, but it's okay. We're gonna find some other ones. So any other questions?
And I just want to follow up because we spoke about this last night. The manufacturing of your parenting. So in that case, as the warm-up question was, what are you looking forward to this summer? Yes. And oftentimes our goal, and my wife is an educator, so it is the time in the year where our family can plan that summer vacation. So there is going to come a point, thanks to this work, where we are going to have to intentionally not plan that summer vacation so that we can accommodate the work schedule that we want our teenage daughters to have. So thinking about having to step back from my intention is to have that great trip to Italy, but I actually want to make sure that in the long run, the girls have an opportunity to work in the summer. So did you want to add anything else to that
No, that's
manufacturing?
perfect, which is basically gets down to sort of sacrifice and inconvenience on the part of the parent. I think a lot of helping kids learn these lessons requires parents to do less of what they might be able to do. And I think that's hard because, it's meaningful. It's years of your life, too. There was a woman I was shared the story of in this book who was trying to, they love traveling, so they take their son on these great trips, and then like one day they realized he's getting way too used to these super nice trips, so they had a new plan, which was, okay, A, you're going to plan the trip, son, because we want you to build that skill and not just show up and, have it all catered for you, but 2, we're going to set a budget for you. And you're going to have to plan it within that budget. Great idea, but she said, honestly, the hardest thing about that was my husband and I sticking to that budget, because he'd come to us and be like, oh, I could do this if I got a little more. And they'd be like, no, we can't raise the budget. Meanwhile, obviously it would have been maybe a nicer trip if they'd done that. And so it is sort of just living with less and there was a woman last night who shared about not getting the kid the car, even though it would have been a lot more convenient for everyone if the kid had the car. But so I think there is something about balancing that. And being intentional about it.
So I'm curious, over the course of your 50 interviews, did you have an experience where the child or children were overly generous? So a small example, every homeless person we pass on the street needs $1. Mom, do we have $1 for this person? Mom, do we have $1 for that person? How about $5 for this person? So was that a pattern that you discovered? And if so, how and why was that? How was that dealt with?
Yeah, that's a great question and complicated question. What I'd say is I didn't get it so much with the young kids, but what I see a lot in my work and I saw in these interviews is these youngish inheritors, say 22, 23, and there's a couple people in the book who find out, like at 23 or 24, that they are going to inherit significant money. That sense of shame, sort of not feeling comfortable with the fact that I have all this, sometimes translates into, I just want to get rid of this. I just want to get rid of all this. I don't want to be on this side of the fence with more. There was a woman who spoke to me about this book. She's a philanthropy advisor, and she said that there was once a guy who just cold called into her office with like a box of trust documents. He was like, I don't want any of this. Can you help me give it away? And so I think it's helpful to help kids understand it's great to be generous. It's great to help people. It's great to want to help people. But let's make sure the impetus to help is coming, where's it coming from? Is it coming just because you want to help? Or are there emotions underneath there, like I feel bad that I have these things and this other person doesn't have these things, and help them explore that. And then, of course, you can get as detailed into, like, is that maybe the best way to help that person? Is it not? I think it's great when kids are asking, and I think it's always opportunities for conversations. Just, like, I remember my daughter had a similar thing, and then we talked about, like, it really is a tough thing. Do you give it to help, or is this going to enable this person doing something that's not going to really be helpful to them? And just exploring some of the trade-offs and helping kids be cognizant about that so they can sort of factor that in. But I think it's a complicated problem, but it's not the worst thing that there's a motivation to help, I'd say. So trying to channel that into a way that's productive, I guess. So thank you for that question. Any other questions?
Last question.
Last question.
Just in context. I joke that when my grandfather died, the funeral procession stopped at the family business for my dad and his brother to put their for sale sign in the window. Any conversations about, working in family business that are successful as opposed to the Zell family story?
Yes. So I'm glad you asked that question, because actually my field has an entire field of industry consultants who specialize in family business. And there's a lot of wonderful best practices there. There's actually a book called Borrowed from My Grandchildren by Dennis Jaffe. And I think he and I've been told by people that he and I use similar models of sort of interviewing people for whom it has worked and then sharing that. And so he interviews 100+ year family enterprises and talks about how people did that. There are similarities, I'd say, in our books, which is that you have to allow for reinvention. You have to allow for, I think he calls it pruning, but basically like letting the people who don't want to be involved, not be involved. And similarly, bringing in those who do want to be involved, including spouses. And so I think there's this reinvention and recalibration of who is actually the family that is involved in the business. But I would say a lot of, when I was talking about the breaking free chapter and the letting people go their own way, part of why I think people have struggled with that so much in our field is there's a lot of best practices that were created around the family business world, you know, cousin consortiums, family councils, family constitutions, because people are already locked together. So you need to have the thing that is locked together function well. So it was a way to provide effective governance when people are already locked together. What I've seen happen is now you apply, that's all being applied, the whole superstructure is being applied hook, line, and sinker to a world of liquid wealth where people aren't locked together. And they're still being encouraged to have family councils and do everything together and everything. And I see in these interviews the back end of that, which is like, why? Why are we being told we have to do all this together? Like, why don't we spend our together time doing family reunions and, you know, travel? Why do we have to have intricate trust structures that mean that I can't do anything different than my cousins? And so, so there's a pushback on that when it's not necessary. I wouldn't create structure to lock people together because it doesn't work well. People find a way out one way or the other. So, but thank you for that question. Did the business sell? Sounds like it did. Yeah, it did. All right. So, okay. Well, thank you very much. Yes. Nice to be here with you.
Yep. Can you give me, join me in giving Coventry a hand? Don't want to give you double mic. Okay, so I just have two quick housekeeping, and then I'm standing between you and the rest of your afternoon. Although it doesn't look very appealing outside, but I'm hoping it is a bright, sunny day by the time we get to our cars. The first is that we are delighted to give you all an opportunity to select one of the three books. So when you exit today, please make sure you stop at the registration table. We have copies of the Raised, Aged, and the newest edition, which is Engaged. All three of those are, again, out front. Please grab yourself a copy, share it with friends. Coventry was here in 2017, and everyone spoke about how incredible it was to have her. And so we were as quick as we could when she announced that her third book was coming out and asked her to be among the first stops on her book tour, and she graciously accepted our offer. So again, thank you, Coventry, for joining us. This will not be the last time we see you. I was prodding her last night about what the next project is going to be, but I'm going to respect that she needs some time to experience the glow and then think through, and it might be more on the creative side. But whatever the opportunity is, we will hopefully see Coventry back in Jacksonville soon. And then the second thing, the spring lineup for Donors Forum will conclude in May. On Thursday, May 11th, we will be doing a look at mental health, what is working and what is new in servicing mental health in Northeast Florida. There's an introduction of the 988, the National Mental Health Emergency Line, and so we're going to look at how that structure has impacted the local providers through their referral networks. So if you're at all interested or you would like to learn more about the mental health, that again is on Thursday, May 11th. And that will be at the River Club. We'll send out reminders, but I just wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to hear while you were here. Again, thank you, Coventry, and thank you all for being here and being a great audience.